That's a major aspect, I think, of proper parenting is encouraging curiosity, encouraging the question why, and helping your child have a standing order. I want the world to make sense. And I say the same thing to those kids. Look, demand that of people. Demand that they make sense and that their reasons make sense. If parents raise their kids that way, and if young adults start demanding this of their peers and of their teachers and of their professors and their politicians, that's one of the biggest levers that we have for keeping everyone honest.
Hello, friends. Welcome back to the Hannah Frankman podcast. On today's episode, I'm speaking with my friend Craig Biddle. Craig is the founder of the Objective Standard and the Objective Standard Institute. He's an objectivist philosopher, and he's probably one of the most skilled people I know at drawing philosophy down into the practical. He's very interested in philosophy, not just as a field of study in its own right, but as a modality for both self-help and also life success. And a lot of the work that he does is centered around making philosophy both more accessible to young people in particular, but also helping them see philosophy as a thing that's directly correlated to both their life success and their overall happiness. So I was really excited to have Craig on the podcast because there's a lot that I wanted to talk to him about, and there's a lot that we covered in today's episode. We talk about Craig's arguments for why pursuing happiness is the moral thing to do. And we talk about how that ties back into how parents make decisions about how they want to educate their children and how adults make decisions about how they want to educate themselves. We talk about why education is not a human right. We talk about critical thinking and whether that's even the correct term to use to describe clarity of thought. And we talk about, even though that's a hot topic issue when people are talking about education, why maybe we're thinking about critical thinking incorrectly and how parents should think about teaching their children to be rational contenders with new ideas. And we talk about the philosophy with which Craig approaches his own work in making ideas accessible to young people and how he's built such a huge movement among teens and people in their 20s around pursuing ideas with the live events that he runs every year with his Level Up conference, which I've had the pleasure of attending multiple times. They're fantastic events. The courses that he runs through Objective Standard Institute, and how he thinks more big picture about the work that he's doing and how it fits into helping young people live fulfilled and thriving lives. It's always such a pleasure to talk to Craig. I'm really glad that this conversation got recorded, and I hope you enjoy listening. Craig, I am so excited to have you on the show. This is going to be, I don't know where this conversation is going to take us, but every time we talk, it's fantastic. So I know we're going to go somewhere, probably many interesting places over the course of the next hour and change. But thank you so much for making the time to do this.
I'm delighted to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
So you and I have known each other for 5 years, something like that. It's been a while. I met you when I was working at Praxis, and your organization and Praxis have been friends for many years. So I had the great pleasure of getting to interview you a couple of times for workshops at Praxis when I was working there. You did a couple of phenomenal workshops on writing, if I remember correctly. And that's how I initially fell down the rabbit hole of your work and everything you do with the Objective Standard Institute. And I feel like over the years, there have been so many different opportunities for us to intersect and overlap, and it's always such a pleasure. But I've become such a fan of the work that you're doing because I've gotten to see over the years the way that you've built up the courses at the Objective Standard Institute. I've gotten to watch the conference that you've built over the years and the amazing way that you're bringing philosophy to young people. And so there's a lot that I'm excited to get into today, because I feel like so much of the work that you're doing is very tangentially connected to the work that I'm doing. But I also think from the perspective of a philosopher, there are a lot of really interesting and important things that you bring to the conversation around what young people should be learning. But you're in the trenches doing the work, and you've done what you've built over the past few years is phenomenal. It's been such an honor to get to watch.
Well, thank you. I've really enjoyed watching you from the time we met, and you mentioned that your work is sort of tangential to what I do. I'm trying to make that case more integral and really bring together the kind of thing that you're doing and the kind of thing that Praxis teaches. You, as you mentioned, we met while you were working at Praxis, and I think you were in one of the first cohorts or the first cohort at Praxis. Is that correct?
So this is a common misconception. People think that I went through one of the early cohorts at Praxis. I actually never did the program. I hacked the
Oh,
program. So everybody else paid to do Praxis. I got hired as an intern and got paid to hang around. And so I got like the most Praxis of Praxis experiences because I worked for them. So I was an intern for like a year before I got a real job there. But yeah, I'm like honorary Praxian.
yeah, so you were implementing the principles that Praxis teaches by hacking their very program. Knock on the door and show what you can do and get involved and enjoy. So that's even better. That is interesting. I didn't, for some reason, I did think you were in one of those early cohorts.
Mhm.
But the reason I bring that up is because I think that what Praxis is up to, trying to help young people to realize, hey, don't wait to live. Learn now how to do things that can provide real value to both yourself and other people, and dive into the workforce and learn and level up and learn and level up, right? And I love that Isaac wrote that book, and I think you either helped edit it or participated in it. Forward tilt, this business of lean into life, lean into your opportunities, take serious advantage of the both the opportunities that come up and create opportunities. And you, of course, a couple of years ago at Objective Standard Institute taught a course on how to create opportunities, right, in life. And all of that really healthy self-development kind of thinking, not only, I mean, currently, yes, it is tangential to the work that I do in philosophy, particularly morality and epistemology, or the theory of knowledge, but they ought to be fully integrated in my view, right? We ought to have a holistic view of how it is that we live and that we teach young people to live. Live a beautiful life, lean into things, lean into your career, lean into your hobbies and friendships and romance, make your life great. Oh, and by the way, that's not just fun and enjoyable and brings you happiness. It's also the morally correct thing to do. And we can demonstrate that. And once you do demonstrate that and you know this to be the case, it's kind of a life changer because it means your worldview is integrated with, rather than in some way undermining or at odds with, your goal of a wonderful life. And so I love that what you do and what I am working on, there is a tangential element, but the more we can make it integral, the better.
We're going to come back to a couple of different points that you just made there because there's a lot of meat that I want to get into in what you just said. But first of all, I think the most obvious question to ask you is, how is living a good life moral? Can you make that argument?
Yeah. So this, goes to really the essence of morality, or what sometimes is referred to as the metaphysical elements of morality, or meta ethics. How do we know what is the good, right? We think, when we think about morality, we typically think of, well, what's the right way to act? And the answer to that question presupposes an answer to the question, well, it depends. What is the right goal to go after? What is the thing you ought to be doing? What is the nature of the right goal or the good thing to do? And in ancient Greece, and certain other cultures, the idea was that morality is about good living. Aristotle called it eudaimonia, right, which is roughly happiness or flourishing. That's the good life. That's what you're supposed to go after. And then the question, well, how do you act in order to achieve that goal followed, and you sort of a causal relationship. If that's the goal, then you ought to do these things. So it's conditional. As time went on and various religions got involved in the question of what's the morally correct thing to do, instead of the goal being live a good life, achieve happiness, achieve flourishing or eudaimonia, it became serve God, obey God, do what God wants you to do. And these are very much at odds. And what I'm trying to do, and what Ayn Rand, the philosopher whom you know I love, is what her philosophy is all about, is returning to the sort of Aristotelian roots of morality and the idea that, hey, the purpose of this thing we call morality or ethics is to help us live a beautiful life, to help us achieve what is called the good life, and get away from the idea, what I believe is a corrupting idea in this sphere, that that what morality is all about is giving up your values, sacrificing for some higher good, whether it's God or community or your neighbor or the environment today. I mean, that's another form of sacrifice. And so the argument for your flourishing or happiness being the correct goal, that is interesting. And that's where Ayn Rand's whole approach to morality is just so revolutionary. Instead of saying, what is the traditional goal that people have said we need to pursue, in which case you might have Aristotle in conflict with, St. Augustine, because they have different views on that. She stepped back and said, well, why do we need this thing at all? Do we need morality? And if so, why? If we don't need it, let's throw it out and move on with life. If we do need it, if there's some fact of reality that gives rise to the need of this thing, then whatever that fact is, or whatever those facts are, that's going to shed a whole lot of light on what constitutes a correct and objectively, factually grounded moral code. And Rand, in a brilliant process of induction, works out this kind of investigation where she says, what is morality and do we need it? She says, well, it's a code of values to guide man's choices and actions, right? The choices and actions that determine the purpose and course of his life. And this is true of any moral code, right? If you say to a Christian, what is morality? They say, well, it's the way you're supposed to act. And these principles are supposed to guide your actions across your life. And then Rand says, well, okay, why do we need that? Why do we need values at all? So values being the centerpiece of that, a code of values or a code of principles of action. Why do we need that? If we don't need it, again, throw it out. If we do need it, then the reason why we need it is going to shed some light on what constitutes an objectively grounded factual thing here. And she proceeds to continue to ask, what is this thing and why do we need it? And what she realizes is that values are the objects that living things take action to gain or keep. Right? And you see this in human beings. You and I go after good grades or job or money or romantic relationships or whatever. Animals, tigers, lions, birds, etc. They go after certain things in order to achieve those things. And even plants and trees go after things. They shoot their roots into the ground, turn their leaves toward the sky. So Rand observes that this is what values are, things that living organisms act to gain or keep. And then she says, well, what difference does it make whether they achieve these things? Why does it matter? Again, why does this thing matter? Do they really need these things? Do they need to act to gain or keep things or not? If they don't, again, let's throw this thing out. If we don't need values, we don't need them, let's move on. She gets to the end of the road through this series of sort of question asking, and she realizes that there's a fundamental alternative in the universe that pertains only to living things. Living things can either remain in existence or go out of existence. Their life can go out of existence. And she realizes at this point that life, the life of an organism or the thing in question, is its standard of value. It's the reason why the living organism, or whatever kind it is, actually needs to pursue values and actually does pursue values. So as she puts it, life is what makes values possible, and life is also what makes values necessary. It's the fundamental. Well, having realized this through an inductive sort of investigative, observation-based process. She's looking at reality and saying, what does this concept actually refer to? She comes to the conclusion that life is the standard of value, and that for human beings who have free will and can choose our values, life is the standard of moral value. So the life of a human being is properly the thing he refers to when he's trying to determine, hey, should I act this way or should I act that way? Well, which way is going to make my life better? Which way is going to support my life, enhance my life, enable me to live as a human being? So, that's a shotgun version of this way that Rand thought through this process. But it's also the validation of the idea that your life and the flourishing of your life, you living fully as the kind of being that you are, a rational being, a being that survives by thinking and understanding the world and choosing values that serve your life and going after those, that is the good. Doing that is good because that's the very reason that you need values at the most fundamental level. So this is where, as I said earlier, I'm trying to help people integrate self-development and flourishing with moral principles. And if you see Rand's derivation of life as the standard of value, and by life, she means living fully as a human being. She doesn't mean just, keeping your heart beating. She means living as the kind of being you are. We talk about that. What is human nature? But when you see that and you pull it all together, it means that instead of morality being this thing that undermines your pursuit of a loving, beautiful, happy life, it's something that supports and integrates and then provides you with guidance. Because the whole way that moral principles come up from life being the standard of value is we then ask the question, what serves our life? What makes us able to live physically, and what makes us able to achieve happiness spiritually, and what kind of social environment do we need in order to function together in harmony rather than at war with each other? It starts to answer all of those questions, or provides the groundwork, I should say, for answering all of those questions in a scientific way.
I love that we're getting straight into the meat of this. And I think that there's so much here that's really important. And I think everything that you're talking about, it's not necessarily a conscious process that everyone who's listening to this show is going through, but subconsciously, I think it absolutely acts as like what you just described as the map of the process that people are going through. Because anyone who's listening to this show found me through my work somehow, unless they're your audience, in which case, of course, they're already very aligned with the work that you're doing. But people who are here because they listen to the show on a regular basis, they found their way here because they're on some sort of non-status quo path. They're interested in something beyond just normalcy and prescription. And by nature, that necessitates that they're thinking somewhat critically about what they want out of life. They're not just satisfied with the first item on the menu that's handed to them. And so something is driving that rationality of, okay, I don't want what's normal. I want something different. And I have to figure out what that is, because by nature, different does not come in pre-prescribed packages that you can just take off the shelf. You have to get creative in designing it. And whatever the underlying motivation is, the trigger point is that made someone say, this status quo path is not for me. People are thinking, whether logically, rationally, consciously or not, they're going through a process of figuring out what is important to them. And a lot of the driver of that is, at some level, the pursuit of happiness, which I don't think we talk about nearly enough in, really any context, but especially like career development, personal development, educational development. Like, it's one of the core underlying tenets. We can go deep down a rabbit hole at this, but it's one of the core underlying tenets of our country too: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And yet we really kind of forget about the pursuit of happiness part a lot, or we don't think about it with the weight that I think it deserves as like a core tenet of how we do life. But I think everything that you just described is the process that people are going through when they're thinking about, okay, what do I want both for me and also for my children? Like if I'm a parent, what is the life that I want to be living as a parent, and what is the life I want my children to have? If you're an adult who's self-educating or a continued educator, you're thinking about what you want your life to be. And happiness is a core underpinning of that, and self-fulfillment. And that's one of the rabbit holes that I want to go down with you too in this conversation is I think so much of the work that you do is like it's designed to help humans flourish. Like I hear you use this word a lot, human flourishing, and I think it's such a beautiful term. We should use it more than we do. I like that you use it as much as you do. But we're as parents and as educators, like a core part of our job is setting humans up to flourish. And you do such a great job. Like that's such a core underpinning of all of the work that you do. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you think about human flourishing, like how you define it, but also because you're not just thinking about it in this very heady, abstract way. Like you're bringing it down into very grounded reality. Your organization is teaching very practical courses. You're running conferences where people are meeting each other in real life and building like very tangible connections, but they're also learning tangible real world skills. They're not just thinking about philosophy all the time. And so I'm very curious, like how your own thinking around flourishing, both philosophically, but also in a very grounded way, like what some of the core pieces of this are, because you spent so much time thinking through this that I think a lot of people are sort of feeling around intuitively, but don't necessarily have words to describe.
Yeah, so great question and a perfect rabbit hole for the talking about the kind of work that I'm up to and what OSI Objective Standard Institute is trying to do. If we want to figure out how to flourish, if we want to figure out how to, have a life that we really love, that we wake up and it's like, hey, I get to live again another day and do the things that I love. And you want to sustain this over time for multiple decades, right? I mean, that's what a life of flourishing is. You do work that you love, you have recreational activities you love, you engage with people who bring you, joy and fill your life with that kind of meaning. That's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about flourishing. It's living the kind of life that we think about when you think of somebody really having happiness and having his or her life in order in all the various areas. So you do work you love, you have recreational activities you love, you engage in art that you love, whether you love to listen to music or watch movies or whatever. That sort of fuels your soul, so to speak. And you have various work relationships and friendships and romance, the whole nine yards. So that's the picture that I think everyone can relate to, right? That's what you want in your life, and if you have that, if you can achieve that, I regard that as flourishing. That's what I mean by flourishing, living the fullest, most robust version of what a human life can be. Now, we're all different in myriad respects, right? You and I have different values. You might like certain sports and I like different sports. You might like certain art and I like different art. But we also have some similarities. We have some fundamental similarities as human beings. We have a nature. Human beings have a nature, right? And the essence of our nature, as I like to put it, is that we basically have two mental faculties that we have to understand. You've got a rational faculty, your ability to look out at the world, experience things through your senses, and understand the world. Right? This is what enables us to put things together, build huts, or figure out how to make a fishing line, and figure out how to do the things that enable us to live. That's reason. It's the faculty that identifies and integrates the material that we observe with our senses. And through a process of logic, we can form concepts and think about things and come up with all sorts of big ideas, right? That's why there's a satellite in the sky enabling us to have a conversation, is because a bunch of really smart people use their minds to do that. And that's true of every value that's out there. Every man-made value, right? Someone had to do that thinking. That's reason. But then we have this other mental faculty in here, our emotional faculty, right? And we feel certain ways. We can get very excited and enthusiastic about things, or we can be depressed and we can be angry about things, right? That whole other faculty is sitting in there with the rational faculty. And the difficulty that so many people have is, how do you live a life where these two faculties are in harmony rather than at odds with each other? A lot of people feel like, well, I know this is true and I know I should do this if I want to, do better in school or lose some weight or get more fit or whatever. But I feel afraid of doing that, or I'm intimidated by this process or whatever. And there's your emotions. And what I think the key to really living a good life and really understanding what it takes to flourish is understanding the difference between these two faculties, what their exact natures are, so that you can treat them both exactly as they deserve to be treated, which enables them to work together in harmony. And the way I like to put it is this: if you keep in mind that reason is your means of understanding the world, and that your emotional faculty is your psychological means of enjoying your values, right? Your favorite sports team wins the game and you feel really excited. Why? Because that's your team, right? You value that team. Them winning gives you this sense of joy. Likewise, if you ask out the girl or guy and he or she says yes, right? That you value that potential relationship. Now you have a yes, you feel really good. Emotions are super important. In fact, if we didn't have emotions, there would be no point in living. Why take action? Why do a bunch of thinking to take action if you're not going to feel good and enjoy the thing you're trying to do? So your emotions and your rational faculty are both absolutely essential to human life, but they're different. And this is where it's so easy to get confused. A lot of us sometimes will feel like, well, you got either get afraid of doing something or you really want something, and you convert that into knowing that you should do it or knowing that you shouldn't do it or whatever. But your emotions aren't your means of knowledge. They're just not. That's not what they do. What they do is they provide sort of an automatic indication of the value or disvalue of something based on your preconceived knowledge and preconceived notions of what's good and bad. Your rational faculty is the thing you need to use to figure out whether you should take this action, whether you should ask this person out, etc. And if you treat them accordingly, if you say, look, I'm going to pay attention to my emotions, I'm never going to shove them out of the picture or ignore them or pretend that they're not there. I'm going to take them into account, but I'm going to use my rational faculty, and the emotions are going to simply be another kind of data that I'm going to think about. So it's not Spock-like and push emotions out of the picture and just go by logic. Instead, it's treat your rational faculty as what it is, your means of knowledge. Treat your emotional faculty as what it is, your means of enjoying life and experiencing values. And then get them to work together. So you say, what would make my life wonderful? That's a question about your potential emotional states. Oh, your reasoning mind comes in. If I were to go through this program, say at Praxis, and learn how to do these things, then I could go out and get a job doing X, Y, or Z, and that would make me feel really great. Now they're working together. Now, by treating them as what they are, you're not putting them at odds with each other. You're letting them harmonize. And to me, this is like one of the most important intersections of human nature that is mostly ignored by people. And it's ignored because it's a complex area, and a lot of people just don't know what to do with it. But if you can get that relationship to work in your life, if you can get your rational faculty and your emotional faculty to harmonize, it's a game changer.
I want to talk a little bit about the work that you do in the context of this, because you're doing such a great job exposing young people to philosophical thought and rational thought. And this is something that there is one of the big buzzwords in the education conversation is critical thinking. Everybody has something to say about this when you get on Twitter and you start following people who are talking about the problems in education and you start scrolling through any series of conversations on Twitter, everybody has opinions about critical thought. And it's one of the biggest criticisms of the status quo of how we educate people in America and in the West in general is we don't teach critical thinking. Kids need to learn critical thinking. But it's usually very poorly defined. It's sort of this catch-all phrase that means a lot of different things, but most people aren't sitting around defining terms. And so much of the work that you do is around exposing young people, teenagers and young adults primarily, to philosophy and rational thought and tools for thinking. And I have a series of questions for you about this. But the first one is just, how would you define critical thinking? Or is that even the term that you would choose to use?
So I typically don't use the word critical thinking, but I don't have anything against it either. I like to think in terms of clear thinking or objectivity. And objectivity is something that people sort of are like, well, you can't really be objective about things. And that's one of my big pushbacks is, yes, you can, if you understand what objectivity is. Objectivity is the relationship between the mind, you're in here, you're thinking, and some fact out there. And if that relationship corresponds and is positive, like, you and I know that we're having a conversation right here and now, right? So there's the in here and there's the out there. We know it because we're observing it happening, right? That's the simplest form of that. But this same relationship can and does happen in myriad ways in human life. And when people are talking about critical thinking or logical thinking or clear thinking or anything of the sort, usually what they're doing is they're thinking in terms of either physical relationships, so mechanics and engineers and physicists, people who deal with the physical sciences. Well, they can think, objectively to some extent, because, you either put the bridge together in a way that's going to hold the cars and stand, or you don't, right? And there's an either or, it's sort of black and white. Likewise, even to some extent for logical arguments, right? If somebody said, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. You just take some deductive logic like that, and people can say, yeah, okay, that makes sense. But when you get to things like values, when you get to the issue of how do you know how to think objectively about right and wrong, about good and bad, about, value and not value, or the like, then everyone's head just sort of blows up and they don't know how to think critically there. Indeed, we're all told that you can't derive moral principles from the facts of reality. You can't derive an ought from an is, as it's typically put. And so that whole area is cordoned off and treated as a non-scientific, non-fact-based sphere. Well, that's a massive portion of human life. That's every time we use the word good or bad or should or shouldn't or ought, any of those words, we're not allowed to be scientific. We're not allowed to say that, no, what we're talking about here is factual. So to me, if you want to think really clearly, if you want your critical thinking, if you want to use that phrase, if you want to have that pervade the entirety of your life and help you in all of the areas, you've got to be able to think critically and objectively in terms of values as well as in terms of, facts. And indeed, I would go on further to say that you need to understand that values are simply certain kinds of facts. They're not a thing that's separate from facts. They're a kind of fact. They're the kinds of facts that pertain to the requirements of human life and happiness, right? It's a fact. You have a lot of liberty lovers in your audience. We can start there. It's a fact that liberty, freedom, political freedom, is a requirement of a human life. If you lock someone in a cage, be it a slave, say Frederick Douglass, or a whole nation, the people in North Korea today, if you lock people in a cage so that they can't act on their own judgment, they can't decide what they want to do and how to live, they can't live fully as human beings. They might be able to, their heart might keep beating, but they're not living as human beings, right? That's why, that's what's wrong with slavery. It doesn't enable the person to live as a human being. So this is a fact, but it's also a value because it means people should be free. It means liberty is a good thing. And I think a lot of people are okay at that level with this. They don't fully understand that necessarily. And in fact, some libertarians will say, no, we don't need that. We just say that the non-aggression principle is an axiom and so forth. But it's not true that any of this is axiomatic. You have to think to understand why this is the case. But at every level of good and should and ought. So if we say, well, how ought I to live my life today? Set freedom and liberty aside. What should I do in my own life? Well, here I'm using normative language again. I'm using oughts and shoulds and goods. Does that mean I can't think scientifically? Does that mean I can't be critical in my thinking and be accurate and objective in the way that I make decisions? I say you absolutely can be objective there. And this, again, is why I want people to understand the relationship of morality, objective morality, morality based on the requirements of human life, with the rest of the things they do in life. So that when they do get to critical thinking, they don't just coordinate off and say, okay, well, you can do that in the STEM fields, but not in the humanities. You can do that in physics, but not in ethics, right? No, you can do it in all of those areas if you understand how to establish a factual standard of moral value. And once you have that, and that I think is demonstrably the requirements of human life, once you have that, again, it's a game changer in critical thinking as well, because you now can navigate the entirety of human concerns and your life concerns rather than just that small fraction that doesn't have any oughts or values in it.
One of the big criticisms people have of the institutional education system that we have in America is that it does a very poor job teaching young people how to think. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, the problem with education, and you're the better expert at education than I am, so a little bit out of my wheelhouse here, but I certainly have some thoughts on this and some experience. I have a daughter who went to a very good school, and then we homeschooled her for part of it, for part of her high school at least.
Mhm.
But I went through some really bad schools in my day, and it was just a huge waste of time. I was not taught, frankly, I don't know that I was taught anything of substance in my entire years of schooling. I was I was dyslexic, so I had trouble reading, and that was very frustrating. So there was that. But even setting that aside, there were just these huge swaths of 8-hour days that were just wasted, that just went into the dumpster because I wasn't able to investigate things that mattered to me. Now, I'm not of the mind that all kids should just be set free to do whatever the hell they want to do. I know some people are for that, and I'm not. I think a large portion of a child's life should be completely self-directed, and he can do whatever he or she wants to do. But I also think there are certain things that children need to learn if they're going to be able to use their rational faculty really well so they can live their life beautifully. And several of those things include, first of all, you've got to be able to learn how to think just rationally and logically on a basic level. There are laws of nature. Things are what they are, and they can act only in accordance with their identities. And I'll get controversial here, but I don't know how else to do it. Kids go to Sunday school. I was one of them. My father's an Episcopal minister, and we're told that actually there are times when a thing doesn't have to act in accordance with its identity. It can act exactly opposite to its identity, right? A snake can talk, a bush can speak, a man can live inside a whale for 3 days, a dead man can rise after 3. These things don't make any sense, yet we're taught these things as kids, and what it does is like an assault on our rational faculty, because it tells us that there are no fundamental rules and laws of nature to which our thinking has to correspond if our mind is going to stay connected to reality. Instead, just weird, bizarre things can happen and you can't make any sense of it, and you should just accept that and then go try to live anyway. Well, this compromises your capacity to think, and it compromises your confidence in your mind. So that's just one instance. But of course, these assaults don't come only from religion. If in today's world, as is happening, young people are being told that there's no distinction between a man and a woman. This is just literal nonsense. And everyone knows it's nonsense, including the people and the adults who are pretending that they don't know that it's nonsense. But the kids don't know that this is nonsense. They're children. And for adults to be telling them these kinds of things is an assault on their minds. So education comes in multiple varieties, right? You can get it at Sunday school, or you can get it in the public schools, or you can get it in private schools, perhaps some of the better private schools. But in all instances, I think the fundamental that kids need to know is that reality is out there, it's fixed, it's real, and it has properties that we have to correspond to. We don't get to make things up. We don't get to pretend that reality is going to be different and then it will. Right? There's a real world out there. If you step in front of a speeding truck, you're toast. And that kind of black and white either or reality is something that kids should learn very early. And then they should be encouraged over the whole course of their life to adhere to those facts, to adhere to the fact that things are what they are. They have identities. They act only in accordance with their identities. Well, if a kid accepts that, pretty much religion is out of his head, which in my view is a good thing. And then he can move forward and deal with reality from a scientific perspective rather than from a mystical perspective. Likewise, when he encounters what we call today, the wokeists who are trying to pretend that there is no external world and everything's a power struggle, and we can change the meaning of sex, and we can change the meaning of racism, and we can change the meaning of these terms to suit our power, our power needs. That's BS too. And if a kid is raised to know that reality is what it is, and the work of his mind is to understand it rather than to make it up, then he won't buy into that stuff. So that's my, when I think of education, I'm primarily concerned with that kind of fundamental distinction that I think kids need to learn. But I think the way they learn that in the various subjects is, well, you take math and things are what they are. 2 + 2 is 4. You don't get to pretend that it's 5, although new math tells us that you can, right? You study history. Well, certain things happened on certain dates, and we have certain means of knowing that. And some things are more important than other things in history. And these are all facts that a child can and should learn. Literature, certain books are profoundly, richly important to your ability to understand the human condition and the potentials of human life. Other books are not in that category, and we can say that there are standards here, and we can divide things between. Doesn't mean all of the other books are bad, but there's a difference between world-changing, mind-empowering books and books that are relatively frivolous, all things considered. So the job, I think, of educators is to carry through the educational process and into all of the subjects that they teach, whether you're homeschooling or teaching kids in a school, this constant that reality is real. The job of the mind is to understand it, not to make it up, and that pretending that reality is other than it is wrong. It's bad. It's morally wrong, unless you're pretending for the sake of fantasy or fiction. Obviously that's fine. But if you're going to pretend that there's no such thing as a distinction between men and women or the like, or there's no distinction between freedom and an enslaved communist state, that pretense is wrong and anti-life. So that's in education. I want that to be the center, the thread that links everything else together.
I think a lot of parents also spend a lot of time thinking about how to prepare their kids to contend with a world that often doesn't feel rational to an adult, but that kids don't necessarily have the tools yet to navigate. As you just alluded to, the adult in a conversation might understand the logical shortcomings of any particular position, but a kid doesn't because they're just a kid. And I think a lot of parents spend a lot of time thinking about, my kid's going to go out into the world and they're going to encounter all kinds of things that either are illogical or maybe, like, from my perspective as a parent, I don't think is good for them, or that goes against our values as a family. And all of those things can be intimidating for parents, I think, to understand how to navigate. I hear from a lot of people, especially on Twitter, who are, they're trying to figure out, how do I prepare my kids to contend with a world in a way with the world in a way that's both self-directed. Like, I'm not there being a helicopter parent, because that's not doing any good either, because the minute I disappear, the minute they're left to their own devices and are completely unprepared because they've never learned how to do this. Um, but at the same time, I'm not just letting somebody else with a very overbearing perspective come in and you know, so forcibly put a set of worldviews onto my child that they just accept it as true. And I think a lot of people have a very knee-jerk reaction towards the helicopter parent side of things. It's like, well, I'm just going to make sure that I'm louder than the people that I don't agree with. So my kid knows that I'm right. And I think there are a lot of different things that we do this with kids. And it's not long-term helpful, because whatever you're holding your kid's hand through, and I talk a lot about helping kids develop self-direction and independence and agency. And if you're, giving all your kids all the rules and all the hour by hour to-do lists all the way through until they're 18, and it's like, okay, now go out in the world and figure it out for yourself. If they've had no practice doing things for themselves, they're going to be completely lost when you stop telling them what to do. And so I think that's one of the big shortcomings of our education system in general, is we don't really give kids a chance to practice doing adult things and having adult responsibility until they're actually adults. And then we wonder why they're 19 and floundering and drunk on the side of the road somewhere, coming home from a party at 2 a.m. and have no idea how to make good decisions for themselves. It's like, well, they've never had any practice, so of course they're struggling. But I think a lot of parents are searching for, like, what is the balance point where I can allow my child to go out into the world and I can trust their ability to make rational judgments about things, and that they can come across a new idea that is perhaps very forcefully being shared with them, somebody else's opinion that they might intuitively not agree with, but they don't really understand the logic for why. And this other person seems like really nice, and also like they really mean it. And like maybe this other worldview, it's going to be, kids are going to encounter that everywhere, whether it's in politics or in religion or in dietary ideology. This, my kid likes their steak, but then they meet this really compelling vegan and they're like, well, maybe my whole worldview is broken. I don't know. Maybe I'm a terrible person for eating cows. Or vice versa. Maybe they're a vegan and they meet a carnivore and they're like, wait a second, seed oils. Like, I don't know about this. Like, there are so many different things that kids are going to encounter. And so I think a lot of parents are looking for something, like the underlying things that are going to give their child solid footing upon which to contend with the world. And I think some people are looking, maybe even an inoculation. Maybe that's not even too strong of a word, like an inoculation against irrationality by having tools with which to contend, like intellectual antibodies, that when a new idea comes in, it is properly assessed and categorized and either integrated or rejected rationally, depending on whether or not it's useful. How do you think about, because you're in the, your profession is helping young people learn to think critically and understand philosophy. I know you said that critically, clearly, I think is the word that you used. But how do you think about that? The inoculation against ideas that maybe don't carry a lot of value but come in with a lot of passion? Or, what would your advice be to the parent who wants to give their kid a really strong intellectual underpinning with which to contend with the world?
Yeah, great question. And I have the same advice, which I would give in different ways, but it's essentially the same advice both to parents about, how to help their kids to establish a firm connection with reality, a firm mental connection with reality and maintain that over time. And it's the same thing I tell also to young adults I'm working with who are trying to figure out through the fog and confusion of usually very poor upbringings, at least poor upbringings in terms of knowledge and intellect and education. And the thing is this: never stop asking questions. And for parents, encourage your kids to ask why. Encourage them to ask all of the questions. How? How and why being the main two, but why really being the most fundamental. When if you say to your kid, it's time for bed now, and he says, well, but I want to keep reading my book, and or I want to continue this playing my video game, and you say, no, it's time for bed now, and he says, why? A lot of parents will say, because I said so, right? Well, that's a really bad answer. It's also really unnecessary to even if you think, well, I don't have time to give him explanations. Of course, you have time to give him explanations. You don't have, he doesn't have to agree with your explanation, but give him a reasonable explanation and say, well, if we go to bed later than this, you're going to be tired in the morning, which is going to make it harder for you to think in school tomorrow or whatever the case may be. And he might say, no, I don't agree with you. And you can say, that's okay, but that's my reason for saying it's bedtime now, right? You've given him a reason. You don't have to agree with your reason. But what this does is it helps a child expect reasons of people when he or she is asked to do things. And that expectation is huge, right? You want to train your child to expect reasons. And I'll put it another way. You want to help your child learn that he should expect reality to make sense and people's demands and requests to make sense to him, which means make it in effect. I like the concept of make sense because I think of it as it means that the idea makes it to the sensory level. It means I can sort of see the facts of reality that give rise to it. Oh yes, mom, I can envision myself tomorrow tired in school. So even though I'm going to continue to disagree with you about bedtime, I now can see that there's something there that you're reasoning connected to, right? That's a major aspect, I think, of proper parenting is encouraging curiosity, encouraging the question why, and helping your child have a standing order. I want the world to make sense. And if you get that, I think you've done a lot. For young adults we work with a lot of kids, age 18, I call them kids, they're kids to me, but 18 to 25, 30 years old, a lot of people in that sphere. So young adults who are still trying to figure out and get their head around the world and what they want to do and what they believe in and whether or not what they were told by their parents, preachers, and teachers makes sense. And you've been there relatively recently, and you know that the sort of confusion and even to some extent angst that can come with that stage in life. And I say the same thing to those kids. Look, you need to have a standing order. Start asking why about everything that you don't understand. Don't accept things just because some adult or person with a PhD or a fancy robe told you so. If somebody understands something, as Richard Feynman used to say, if you really understand a subject, you should be able to explain it to somebody in clear, simple terms, even like a high school student. And so demand that of people. Demand that they make sense and that their reasons make sense. And I think if parents raise their kids that way, and if young adults start demanding this of their peers and of their teachers and of their professors and their politicians, that's one of the biggest levers that we have for keeping everyone honest, for keeping everyone on the same working toward the same fundamental aim. Hey, here's an idea. Let's understand reality, really understand it, so that we can live well in that place. And the question why and the demand that things make sense, that's the fundamental there.
I want to get your take on an interesting moral question about choosing schools for your kids. So this may have crossed your radar. I don't know if you're familiar with this story or not. I think this was a year or two ago that this story came out. A writer for the New York Times, Nicole Hannah Jones, wrote a story about choosing a school for her daughter. Does this ring a bell to you? Are you familiar with the story? She was in New
A little
York.
bit, but
Okay.
refresh me on it. But yes.
Okay. So she lives in New York. And she was going through the process of choosing a school for her kid. And she had options. And she wrote a piece about why she ultimately decided to send her daughter to the not as good local public school as an act of, this is an oversimplification, but I would summarize it as like, it's as part of the greater good, to not pull her kid just because she had the means. It was basically an article about privilege. Just because she had the means to put her child elsewhere, she didn't think it was in the public good to pull her child out of a school that she was locally zoned for, even if the school wasn't as quality as some of the other options that she had available, but maybe some of the other families in her local district did not have the options to choose. It's an interesting piece, obviously highly controversial take. We wrote a piece about this at Rebel Educator maybe 6 months ago, criticizing this and talking about why the title of the piece, or the subtitle of the piece, was something along the lines of like why you shouldn't sacrifice your child at the altar of equity. Like, it's not your child's job to atone for anyone else or to make the world a more equal place. Like, your job as a parent is to defend your child, not the greater good at the expense of your child. But I think this is an interesting example of a much broader conversation that happens when people are talking about education, where people think that alternatives to the public school system are a privilege, which is very not true. Most of the homeschoolers I know are low income, not high income. And most of the people in the micro school movement, which is like an alternative to the high ticket public schools, they're small, localized private schools. Most of them are median to low income families. There's a very big movement away from traditional education that has nothing to do with wealth. So that is a myth. But people get really up in arms about the people who have and I abhor this word and I keep using it merely because it is the word that is already used in the broader conversation, not because I endorse it whatsoever, but because privilege, they look at people exiting the system as an act of privilege, and they see it as a cost to the collective at large of families in America who have access to the public school system. And I think some people truly frame it as a moral conundrum of, if I'm pulling my child out of the system, I'm doing what's in my family's best interest, perhaps, but at the expense of the collective. And I think that is a ridiculous argument, because if you're helping your child to thrive, like, my worldview is very much a rising tide lifts all boats. And if we have more people in our world who are happy and motivated and self-directed and curious and creative and thriving, and they're going out into the world and building things that create value in the market, which makes, if they're making money doing things, it means other people are finding them valuable enough to pay for them. That's doing good for the world at large. But I think a lot of people get really not people, I think, who are, I think most people who want to pull their kids out of school are pulling their kids out of school. But I think a lot of people in the cultural debate get very lost in the muck of, but who are we hurting if we're pulling our kids out of school? And it runs the whole gamut from, it even gets into the funding issues of, if we're pulling our kids out of public schools, then the public schools are not going to make enough money to survive, and they're going to collapse. And, the kids who didn't have the resources to go elsewhere are the ones who are going to get screwed over while everybody else is, off having a great time at their forest school somewhere. And I'm sure you have strong opinions about the moral arguments of this. And I would love to hear your thoughts about it, because I think this is something that we get unnecessarily distracted by in the broader cultural conversation. And I think it's just outright wrong. But I would love to hear your take.
Yeah, great question and a rich topic. First of all, to just the question of whether it's right or wrong to take your child out of a good school and put him into an inferior school to make some kind of a social point like that. I don't think it's just wrong. I think it's obscene to do that. I think it's morally obscene. You should want the best for your child, and you should strive to achieve the best for your child. And your child certainly will appreciate that if he or she grows up to be a thinker, which hopefully that will happen. But I'd also like to say that it's not the case that when we as parents do something good for our child, that it necessarily is, or even logically is, some negative on other people's children. The only extent to which that could be the case, and you already mentioned it, is when the government is involved in something like schooling, which it should not be, right? Schooling is a service. It's a market phenomenon, and it should be left to the market. It should be a free
Wait,
market phenomenon.
wait. It's not a human right. This is another big debate that people get into.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'll cover that as well as we carry this on. Um, but the only extent to which my removing some degree of funding in some way from a public pool of funding that's supposed to help public schools teach children who are effectively forced to go to those schools, especially if their parents can't afford to send them to a better school. So you have all of this force going on, forced payment, forced attendance, forced curriculum, all of that. And I'm just against all of the force. And that's the thing we need to remove, not quote privilege, and not quote self-interested concern for your child, but physical force. Um, Children should not be placed in organizations run by government bureaucrats with stolen money, who will then hire teachers paid with that money to tell the kids what is true, false, good, bad, right, wrong. That's a very, very bad environment. And it's no surprise that the public schools are the nightmare that they are. Um, Education is an extremely rich and complicated subject. And the best way to have good education in schools is to have competition among educators. People saying, well, here's my theory, and here's my curriculum, and here's why I think it's going to work, and here's the track record that we have for teaching kids and how well they do in life when they've gone through our schools, versus another school who says, well, here's our particular approach to all of those things. That's what you want. And of course, is it James Tooley who wrote the book? Is it The Growing Tree? The one about his travels in Africa and or India, where he discovers that even poverty-stricken families in places where the governments do run public schools are willing and able to pull their kids out of those public schools and put them into very inexpensive private schools where they actually learn how to read, write, and think. And this is a market phenomenon that both is logically true and empirically true. We can look around and see that this happens. A lot of private schools cost a fraction of what it costs the government to send a single student to a so-called public school, which ought to be called a government-run school. So that's the problem here. And if Nicole Hannah-Jones or the like, really wants to solve the problem, it's not that some people have privilege. It's that some people are being forced to give their money to the government, who then spends the money poorly on bad education and forces children to go get that bad education. If you really want to solve the problem, step back and demand that the government get the hell out of education completely, and that we accept education as a marketplace phenomenon, which not only does the competition drive quality up, but like every other market, every other item in the marketplace, the cost of education goes down, and the educational alternatives multiply when you do this, right? And this is why when you go into a grocery store today and there's 800 kinds of, of cereal and, Jesus, even on the meat aisle now, we have, or you're going to get grass fed or you're going to get farm raised or whatever. And there's a zillion things here. Why? Because people are trying to make money on selling that stuff. And so they have to appeal to our interests, our desires. And in the field of education, our interests and desires, hey, we want our kids to learn. And so I'm just against the whole business of government-run schools, and I think that's the problem there. But the sacrifice of your own child to some alleged greater good to me is just obscene. And I think that the reason that people wrestle with that kind of stuff is because they're altruists. They actually believe that the fundamental unit of moral concern is not them and their children and individuals. So they don't see people as individuals. They take this utilitarian approach that, well, the good is the greatest good for the greatest number. That's just this vague, open-ended, nonsensical, unproven. Like, where'd that idea come from? Values don't come into existence because we need to understand how to take care of everyone. Values come into existence because we need to understand how to live, how to think, how to raise our kids, what to do when the question comes, how should we educate Johnny? Well, what's the goal here? Oh, we want him to really learn about reality. Obviously, he needs to learn math and reading and writing. So what's the best way to do that? Well, the last thing in the world you would do is turn to bureaucrats and say, hey, could you guys tell us what to do? How the hell do they know? People are bureaucrats and politicians because they suck at life and can't do other things well, for the most part. So you don't go to them for education or or medicine or anything important. The only thing we should give them is, and it is important, but it means also that most of them would be fired. We should give to the politicians and bureaucrats one responsibility: stop people from using physical force against each other. Use retaliatory force when and as necessary to stop those people from doing that. And otherwise, stay the hell out of our ways and out of our lives. You do that thing and we'll do all the other things. And then education would be a beautiful thing.
I want to go back to the education as a service, not a human rights thing too, because this is also one of the things that bubbles up a lot in the debate around education is people get very adamant that education is a human right, and therefore we can't leave it up to the free market because then a significant portion of the population will be underserved in this thing that they have a right to. Talk about education as a service.
Yeah. So, I mentioned earlier that when, raising kids or talking to young adults about how they, what kind of, mindset they should have about the world, I said that they should always ask the question, why? Or, does that make sense? Well, where did this notion come from that education is a human right? What facts of reality give rise to this idea that education is a human right? I don't see any facts that give rise to that. A right is, in this sense, is a moral prerogative. It's something that you have a moral prerogative to take a certain action. Those things are things like a right to liberty, the right to act on your own judgment. Why do you have that right? What facts of reality give rise to that right? The fact that if you don't act or you can't act on your own judgment, you can't live as a human being. That's where rights come from. They come from our understanding of the kinds of fundamental actions that human beings have to be free to take if they are to actually live as human beings. So you have a right to liberty, that is to act on your own judgment, free of coercion. You have a right to your life, which means a right to take all of the actions necessary to live as a human being, as long as you're not, taking action against other people and stopping them from living as a human being. It's got to be universalizable here. You have a right to the pursuit of happiness, which means to choose the values and goals that will fill your life with meaning and joy and go after those things, right? You have the right to freedom of speech, which means the right to express your views your own way, as long as you're not forcing other people to let you do that. I can't force you to put me on your podcast so that I can say things that you disagree with. But if I want to start my own podcast and say my own thing, I'm free to do that. Now we get to the issue of, but you have a right to education. Well, where did that come from? It's not an action that you know, pursuing, and I have a right to pursue education. That would be included in the right to liberty, right? I have a right as a parent to pursue a good education for my child. That's a right to that's the right of liberty, right? It's included in that. But if I were to say I have a right to be given an education, notice the change of direction here. Pursuing is going out and trying to get something by using your mind and your actions. The right to be given something means that somebody has to give it to you. Well, who is going to give it to you? And if it's a right, does that mean that they have a moral obligation to give it to you? And if that's true, what happened to their right to liberty? What happened to their right to life, to act on their own judgment? The very idea of a right to be given something is in complete conflict with the very nature of rights and the very reason that rights arise as a phenomenon in human life. We need to act in certain ways to live. Those fundamental actions are the things you have a right to do. Do you need an education? Well, yeah. Well, you and I would agree. Well, yeah, it depends on whether you're talking about a good education or a crappy one. If you're talking about a crappy one, actually, you don't need that. What you really need is to learn to use your mind. But set that aside. When we say, do you need an education? If by that we mean a good one, well, sure, you need to learn. So exercise your right. Use your mind to go out and figure out the things you need to know, or on behalf of your child, exercise your right to figure out how you can get a good education for your child. Whether one of you, if you're a married couple, maybe one of you is going to stay home and educate the child while the other one goes out and brings home the revenue, or maybe both parents are working, and maybe you're not even parents, or maybe you're not even married, but you have a child, and you just say, we're going to farm our education out to this guy over here who has a little corner school where they teach kids to read, and you pay that guy to do that. That is what people need freedom to do. One of my favorite quotes from Ayn Rand, who I mentioned earlier, is that what the have-nots have not is freedom, and what they need, what the haves have that the have-nots have not, is freedom. Why is it that we in America, for the most part, have all this abundance of wealth, whereas the rest of the world has nothing, even close to it, or at least most of the rest of the world? And the reason is because we have more freedom than they do. Freedom is what gives rise to the production of wealth by, specialized focus on areas of the economy, whether it's education or healthcare or widgets. And when people are free to pursue and produce those things and trade them voluntarily with other people, we all become really wealthy. And the areas where we're still impoverished, relatively speaking, are things like education. We have crap education. The reason we have crap education is because people are forced to pay the government monopoly on this area that's so important that the government shouldn't be able to get near it with a 10-foot pole.
You're speaking my language.
Oh yeah, I know I
many
am with
levels,
you.
as you well know. And I think I have a lot of thoughts about this. This distinction between pursuing versus being given is very important. And I think I'm about to make a very radical statement that not everyone is going to agree with me on, and some people will take issue with, and that's okay. If we're making the case that the ability to pursue an education is the human right, not being given the education, I think there's a fair argument to be made that in a lot of cases, the way we do education in our country is at odds with that right, because in many ways, kids are actively being discouraged from pursuing the education that would be most beneficial to them. Because I would make the argument that education is much broader than just what you're learning in the classroom, both because what we learn in the classroom is really, it misses a lot. But also learning is not that one size fits all. It's not just, the core subjects that you're supposed to learn in school and nothing else. A child who wants to learn a trade or a skill, who wants to go spend their high school years in an apprenticeship and is told by the state that they have to sit in class all day and memorize mathematical formulas that they couldn't care less about and don't really understand and are never going to use, at the expense of being able to spend that time learning a skill that they actually want to monetize and use as a career, they're actively being blocked from pursuing their education. And so I don't think it takes that long to logic your way to a place where the status quo system is actually, it's not defending the right by protecting kids from working and protecting them from not having access to a local public school. I think there are a lot of scenarios where it's actually impeding kids' ability to have a good education, which is a very radical statement to make. But I think I don't think it's a stretch to say that there are many scenarios where that's actually actively occurring.
It is radical, and I think it's 100% true, and radical in the legitimate and literal meaning of that term means going to the root, right? You're going to the root of the issue here. And the root of the issue in this case is that education proper consists of children learning what they need to know in order to function successfully in this world, live a wonderful life, and enjoy themselves and become adults who are self-sufficient, right? I like the idea of children learning how to do all of this and enjoying themselves while they're kids too. I don't think it's just like childhood is preparation for adulthood. Childhood is living as well, and I think kids should live. But the business of the state determining what these kids need to learn and then putting all of them into a box and treating them as if there's no difference among any of them. And when I was in school, I was utterly bored by school, utterly bored the entire time. And most of my friends were too. There were a few kids who sat in the front of the class and were constantly eager to learn more about what was being taught. But the rest of the class wasn't interested and would rather have been somewhere else, and frankly, would have been better off somewhere else. And what you're talking about here, I think kids need to learn. I mean, they need to learn how to read. They need basic arithmetic. I think it's extremely important that kids understand basic history and a few things. But you do not need to go all the way to 12th grade to learn this stuff. You can learn most of this stuff easily before you're in 8th grade, probably substantially before that. And then by the time kids are that age, and frankly, I think that ought to either be learned at home in a homeschooling environment or in private schools where parents select, this is the kind of curriculum that we think is good for our kid, and we see the track record here, and we're willing to pay this money, so they go there. But when they're all put into a box and treated as if they're identical, and as if they all need the same schooling throughout, that's absurd. A lot of kids would be much better off learning how to weld or do mechanics or learning how to code at an early age. Why is a kid who's really interested in coding, which is a super high level job, why does he have to sit through umpteen hours of reading Shakespeare if he has no interest in that subject? There's no reason for it. So I think that I'm not an unschooler in the sense I think schooling and formal schooling should just be done away with. But I think formal schooling can happen a lot earlier and faster than it does, that kids can be brought to a level where they're now capable of saying, what I'd really like to spend my time learning is this thing, right? Maybe they find a fascination with butterflies and that turns into some career in biology over time or whatever. Or maybe they get interested in building catapults out of wood and discover that their future is going to be in engineering. Why not let them go in the direction that their curiosity takes them when they're, say, somewhere between 10 and 14 years old? I think that's the transition period somewhere in that zone. But I do think prior to that, that parents should help their kids to do the fundamental things that are necessary to using your rational faculty. You really, and the two most important, I think, are reading and writing. Because you've got to be able to express yourself conceptually to do everything else that you need to do in life. All of that said, I am not an expert on this kind of education, and I'm so open to persuasion on these issues. I have a lot of friends. Dr. Andrew Bernstein has written a lot on this subject. You and I are friends of his. Bradley Thompson has written a lot about this. He's at Clemson. Lisa Van Dam has written for my journal several articles on education, and I find enormous value in all of their work. And I know your head is fully in this with Rebel Educator and all of the work you're doing there. So I'm open to persuasion on all of this. My only firm sort of black and white principles is the government should have nothing to do with any of this. And that the fundamental thing that parents and educators should help children to understand is that there are no contradictions, and you've got to keep your mind connected to reality by virtue of that fundamental truth. And that's sort of the end of the road for me on at least early childhood education.
Well, I think one of the problems, and I've said this on the show before, one of the big problems in how we do education is that we attempt to boil it all down to one simple solution that fits all cases and all problems. And that's our first critical error, is that we try to make everything, we try to make one solution for everything. And the reality is that there is no one size fits all approach for every kid. There's just no way. We're very dynamic and complex humans. There is nothing else in life that is one size fits all. We have lots of different kinds of cars, lots of different kinds of houses, lots of different types of diet plans, lots of different types of medical treatments, lots of different types of fashion and career trajectories, because we are dynamic entities. And there is no way that we could design one type of car that fits every type of person's preferences, needs, utilitarian functions, and yet we endeavor to have one type of preparation for life that fits every single person, and that is a critical area. You talked about you were dyslexic and struggled in school because of that, and I find that very interesting because so much of your work is writing and reading and speaking. You're incredibly well read. You're incredibly prolific with the work that you do. And that in and of itself, we could have a whole conversation about your story with that, because I find those stories so interesting when someone, the system does not set them up to succeed at all in an area. And yet they go on to thrive in that modality. But kids have so many different interests and skill sets and challenges and proclivities, and it's incredibly unfair to try to encapsulate everything inside of one system and one approach. And so I think that there are sort of fundamental, indivisible principles and truths about what education can and should be, but I don't think it's as simple as boiling it down into one cohesive thing. It's like, all right, we have the answer and we have solved this problem for every parent and every child in the world, and nobody has to think about this anymore.
Yeah.
That's just not possible, and it misses the entire point. But I want to pivot a little bit, because I also, before we have to wrap, I want to talk a little bit about the work that you're doing now, because you are in the business of exposing young people, particularly like late high school into college age, young adults, to philosophy and to thinking. And there are a couple of things that I find really interesting about what you're doing that I want to get into. The first is that you are making philosophy and ideas interesting to young people. You run a conference that has hundreds of young people internationally attending every year. It's growing on a yearly basis, which has been incredibly fun to watch. I remember the advertisement for the first one that you guys did, I wasn't able to make it because I was moving the same week I was moving to South Carolina for my job at Praxis. And I was so sad that I wasn't able to make it to the event because it looked so good. But I've watched this thing expand and expand over the past few years. And it's been so cool to watch the traction and the momentum that you're building to the point that, I talk to other people in the conference running world who, like, lots of people are talking about you and wondering what you're doing to attract so many young people, because usually conferences built around philosophy and ideas, they have a lot of older attendees and they struggle to get young people through the door. And you're doing such a great job making ideas interesting to young people in a world where there are a million different contenders for their time and attention. You're doing something very right there, but you're grounding it down into the practical, sometimes at a level where it's not even obvious that what you're doing is teaching philosophy. At your conferences, you have speakers talking about all sorts of different things. You've had comedians come in, you've had authors who talk about productivity, you've had entrepreneurs come in and talk about building businesses and building a career. You've had people come in and talk about political topics that feel like they have nothing to do with philosophy. And with the courses that you're teaching through your organization too, a lot of them are very practical. Like the one that I taught is about opportunity and helping people think opportunistically about their careers, which, we could talk all day about how that really is just applied philosophy, but it's not obvious that it's philosophy. And so I think what you're doing is really important, but it's also the approach that you're taking is really interesting. And so I want to dig in a little bit to how you think about this approach to making applied philosophy both feel relevant and prescient to a point that kids actually want to spend time on it, but also what are you doing that's getting the attention of so many young people that you have hundreds flying in from all over the world to attend your events every year? Because that's really cool.
Yeah, so I think the secret sauce here is the use value of the ideas, the practical use value of philosophic ideas. In the way, I'll return to my good friend, the law of excluded middle, right? Either a given philosophic idea or set of philosophic ideas is helpful to living and loving your life, or it isn't. It's either or. If it's not, if it's of no help in living, then why spend any time doing it? Just throw the thing away and move on. But if there is use value in an idea, then mining that idea for that use value, putting that idea to work in your life helps you succeed, right? And so we just have this like black and white approach to philosophy. Philosophy, properly done, in my view, is a guide to help you understand the world, think clearly so that you can act successfully and live a beautiful life, right? And if it's not helping you do those things, in my view, it's just not legitimate philosophy. Now, philosophers, so-called philosophers, might come along and argue exactly the opposite. They might say the use value is precisely what makes it not philosophy. That's just self-help. We do in the ivory tower this stuff that has no use value, and that's why it's so important. And to them, I say, fine, continue with that nonsense, and I'll continue dealing with the real philosophy that helps people to think well and live well. So I just have this black and white line, or bright line, I should say, between useful philosophy and not useful philosophy. And we only focus on useful philosophy, and we try to make very clear at every turn what the use value of the ideas are. And of course, Ayn Rand's philosophy, objectivism, is all about the use value. It's, the epistemology, or the portion of the philosophy that's about how you know what's true and how you validate things. It's all about keeping your mind connected to reality so that your ideas are both drawn from reality and therefore applicable to reality. Her ethics is all about, how to, or what principles can help you to live a wonderful life, succeed in your career, succeed in relationships, succeed in treating in enjoying emotionally the things that matter to you in life, from art to romance and the like. It's all the use value. And so this is what gives rise to something like the conference that you mentioned. We have this conference called Level Up. And you're going to be speaking at the 2024 event, by the way. Ayan Hirsi Ali is on the roster. You're on the roster, several people from OSI. And we're still right now orchestrating the rest of the conference. We've got so many names we're working with right now to decide who to invite and how to build what's going to be another really, really rich conference. But the purpose of these conferences is precisely this. We hold that there are essentially two master values that everyone who is sane and clear thinking wants in life. One is flourishing. You want to be happy. I mean, there are some people who don't want to be happy, but that's literally a psychological problem. And the vast majority of people, they do want to be happy, and they should want to be happy. And so that's the flourishing element. And then there's the freedom element, which is the necessary social environment, or social political environment that you need in order to flourish. So we hold these two master values, freedom and flourishing, as things that are absolutely important and that young people are both interested in and want to learn how to do these things, how to flourish, how to defend freedom. And then what we say, in effect, is, all right, if you want those things, what are the underlying ideas and principles and institutions that are necessary for us to have those things, to achieve those things? So the theme of the conference is philosophy for freedom and flourishing, or you can think about it just as ideas for freedom and flourishing. What are the ideas that will help us live beautiful lives and defend freedom on solid ground? And I love this theme because it enables us to invite all sorts of people from all different professions to talk about all different things that pertain to these two things, right? We can have we had Max Lugavare spoke last year on nutrition. We've had several people in the past talk on, good exercise techniques. So we focus not only on the mind, but also on the body. And we're all about sort of mind-body integration. Treat your being, yourself, as the whole thing that you are. You're a body. Your body matters. Take care of it. Eat well. Exercise. You're a mind. You have material. You have spiritual values, both the rational faculty we talked about earlier and your emotional faculty. How can you live a beautiful, emotionally rich life by using your mind, your rational faculty, to design a life that brings that to you? That's flourishing, right? Or at least that combined with the physical elements. So that conference is just all about, ideas for freedom and flourishing, and we have everything from, as you mentioned, I mean, we'll have sometimes strictly philosophical lectures, maybe something on ethics or on purpose in life or something like that. We'll have people talk about literature or architecture, something in the arts. We'll have someone come in and do something on like in your wheelhouse, how to build a brand for yourself, how to brand yourself in the world so that you can be more successful. Or as you and I have talked about, something maybe a theme, how to break the rules, or how and when to break the rules, right? The kinds of advice that young people need and yearn for, but rarely are given straight. And so that's what that conference is about. And I hope your listeners will look it up. It's called Level Up. It'll be in Atlanta. June 19 through 21 this year. And then the other things that Objective Standard Institute does, Level Up is a conference under the umbrella of Objective Standard Institute. But we also at OSI teach online courses about all sorts of things. As we already mentioned, you taught a course on how to find and create opportunities in life. We teach courses. We do reading groups on various books, sometimes Ayn Rand books, sometimes other philosophers. We have courses on the arts. We've had several courses on fiction or movies, and how to sort of analyze and get the most value out of the arts. So we have all sorts of things, all of which come under the sphere of philosophy for freedom and flourishing, doing these two things and doing them beautifully. So that's really my MO in life, is to focus on ideas that help us to do those things and bring those ideas to young people who, to some extent, are already thinking in that direction. But what we want to help them do is really integrate their thinking and connect it to sort of a whole worldview that takes good living seriously and treats that as the thing you should do as a matter of principle, the thing that's morally right to do to make your life beautiful and to try to maintain the political conditions necessary for that, which are, freedom. So
I've been to multiple of your events. I've also spoken to a large number of young people who've attended them, and I feel like some of the themes that I see in the benefits people are getting from attending your events, you're helping them, I think, name a lot of intuitions that they have about the world and start to put language to it and start to put logic around it in frameworks that they can more easily navigate and understand and plug new pieces of information into. I think a lot of the philosophical ideas that you talk about are things that you have a lot of really smart young people coming to your conferences and attending your courses, and I think a lot of them sort of have intuitions about how the world works, but they haven't necessarily discovered the language to describe and articulate it. And so you're helping them bring their experience down into articulatable reality. And then simultaneously, you're giving them all of these tools for execution, whether it's something pragmatic, like you said, like, thinking about nutrition because they want to be healthy because that helps them live a better life, or thinking about career strategy and design, or something, the philosophy of interpersonal relationships or something where they're learning how to, navigate things in their world more directly and more advantageously. But then you're also building community of around these events where people who share the same types of ambitions and interests are coming together, which is also one of the really amazing things that I think you're doing that makes your events and your courses really, really cool. And obviously I'm a little biased this year because I'm speaking, but speaking as a past attendee who was merely at the conferences to enjoy the content being presented and meet cool people, I definitely I will endorse all of your events. They're amazing. And we'll share in the show notes a link to this year's conference. Highly recommend attending if able, if you have if you're a parent who has teenagers interested in these kinds of ideas. It's a fantastic event if you're a young person or not a young person, because the attendees, it's not all young people at your conference. It's a full range of ages in attendance, but highly recommend. It's a really great event. Craig, if people have enjoyed this conversation and want to learn more about your work and what you do, I will share again the links for Level Up and the OSI courses in the show notes where people can find them. And for those who don't have the show notes handy, just look up Level Up Conference or Objective Standard Institute, and you'll find all of those things there. Is there anywhere else that you would send people to find more of your work or to learn more about what you do?
The other places I would recommend are the Objective Standard, and there we have two things that are similarly named. So there's Objective Standard Institute, which is the institute that puts on the Level Up conferences and teaches courses on philosophy and practical ideas for good living. And then there's the Objective Standard Journal, which is a journal of philosophy and culture. It's been around since 2006, and it's a quarterly journal that writes about all sorts of things, from the arts to psychology to education to philosophy, from an objectivist perspective, from the perspective of Ayn Rand's philosophy of reason, rational egoism, and individualism, and laissez-faire capitalism on the political level. So those are the two places to find me for the most part. I'm on some social media, but very inactive there. I can't. Every time I try to get active there, I get disgusted by the vitriol and the sort of environment there. So I don't do much there. But I do encourage and invite all of your listeners to check out Objective Standard Institute and come to our conference, this Level Up conference where Hannah will be speaking. It's just an amazing. You mentioned the community environment there and the sort of the friendships that you meet. And we were talking before we started today about the number of people who have met and fallen in love and gotten married from these events that we throw, and it's pretty high number. But the community aspect of these conferences is amazing, because what you're doing is coming together with a bunch of people from all over the planet who have in mind the same basic idea. Hey, let's figure out how to use our minds the best we can to live beautiful lives and defend liberty on solid ground. And when you get people coming together with that attitude, magical things happen. You just the conversations into the evenings and the relationships that you establish and the networking that you do, it's really life-changing. And various people have formed businesses together, formed relationships, either work relationships or romantic relationships or long-term friendships or whatever, at these events. And that's just the sort of cherry on the top of all of the spiritual and knowledge, spiritual values and knowledge that you gain from these events. So hopefully people will come join us this summer.
Absolutely. Again, link is in the show description. At least, yeah, people should definitely check it out. It's amazing. Craig, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. This has been super fun.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right, that's a wrap for this week. Thank you so much for being here. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple, please leave a 5-star rating. Ratings are how this show gets discovered by other people, and it helps me bring in better guests. And no matter where you're listening, please like and subscribe to the show to make sure you don't miss a future episode. That's all for this week. Thank you so much for being here. I'll see you next week.